US officials have reportedly been told by Israel that a ground invasion into Lebanon is imminent. Let's speak to Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, who is a spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces. Thank you very much, Steve, for coming on the programme. Is the Washington Post right to say that Israeli special forces are now on the ground in Lebanon?
Tom, I think there are a lot of reports circulating. Of course, there's we've been had a lot of forces on the ground in the border area over the last few days. You've reported it, you've seen it. I want to be very cautious at drawing conclusions from incomplete information. From our perspective, we're continuing to strike Hezbollah wherever they are. And I would say we're doing it at three different levels. First of all, seeking out their senior leadership, the Hassan Nasrallahs and the successors that are trying to come up forward. Secondly, I would say we're conducting extensive strikes against their strategic assets. So we would be surface-to-surface missiles, surface-to-air missiles that they have, coast-to-sea missiles, guided missiles, all of the advanced systems that they've accumulated over the last 20 years in order to fight a war against Israel. And finally, the third component is taking out the operators that are trying to conduct strikes, attack Israel, either cross-border attacks or even rocket attacks against us. So I would say there's still a lot going on, and I don't want to jump to any conclusions.
So in answer to the question, is a ground invasion imminent? Your answer is maybe.
Imminent is means that it can happen any moment. And of course, the IDF defense chief was speaking to forces just last week on Wednesday. And he said, your boots could be in Lebanon within days. So I think we need to understand that the operations that are ongoing are focused in order to fulfill the government's instructions of restoring safety and security to permit the return of 60,000 Israelis that have been evacuated from their homes for a year now. Now, Israel chose the path of diplomacy and for a year has been very patient, and that patience has now been lost. And so the idea is that we will create the terms and conditions so that Israelis can go home safely and securely. And so that that reality can be realized, we have a huge set of tools in our toolbox, including perhaps ground operations. We know that Hezbollah was planning to launch 7th of October strikes because in 2015 they published.
Well, what happens, Lieutenant Colonel, what needs to happen for Israel to say that they have won this operation, whether it's ground or just air, against Hezbollah? What does winning look like?
There are two ways. I think, first of all, the win will look like when 60,000 Israelis can go back to their homes. That will be a very distinct image of victory. I think that is the right thing to expect.
And how long might that take, potentially?
I mean, there are two different routes. I mean, there could be an extended war, which nobody has any interest over. And there could be the diplomatic effort. Now, ideally, and this is what we've been trying to achieve over the last year, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 from 2006 was supposed to ensure that there is no Hezbollah rockets, missiles, weapons in the south of Lebanon anyway. That failed under the umbrella and the watchful eye of the United Nations peacekeeping forces that were in the south of Lebanon.
That resolution, 1701, which you've referenced there, which Netanyahu referenced in his speech at the UN too, that's not legally binding, though, is it?
When you sign a ceasefire agreement or come to a ceasefire in the aftermath of a war, like the last war with Lebanon, and all parties agree on these terms and conditions, there is an expectation that there should be no weapons in the south.
But it's not legally binding. And I put it to you, Lieutenant Colonel, for a second. I put it to you that it is the height of hypocrisy, some would argue, for Israel to be saying that Lebanon and Hezbollah should be abiding by a UN non-legally binding resolution when Israel has ignored many UN Security Council resolutions which are legally binding.
Yeah, well, we can talk about those types of principles, but what we really need to understand is that if that United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 would have been implemented, there would be no war. And now we are in a situation where 60,000 people have been evacuated now for a year. And while we have been trying to reinstate the 1701 rule under the assistance of the United States and France, That has not been realized. So I would say, yes, you wouldn't be happy about being evacuated from your home for a year, and you would demand that the government allows you to go home in safety and security. And so
why
1701 is, I would say,
hasn't
1701
Israel?
is a benchmark.
Yes. Okay.
But ultimately, what is required is that Hezbollah do not have the power to conduct a 7th of October type attack.
So why hasn't Israel abided by the UN Security Council legally binding resolutions if it believes that the power of the UN should be upheld by countries that also signed to these agreements?
That's a good question, but I think at the moment what we're looking at is a war that we're talking about, which is almost every day now escalating. And
yes.
I think if we need to,
it's very kind of you to think that it's a good question, Lieutenant Colonel. Would you have an attempt at trying to answer it?
Absolutely. We need to make sure that Hezbollah does not have that power to, as a terrorist organization, terrorize 60,000 Israelis on the border with Lebanon. We can do it either through negotiations or we can do it with military force. Currently, we're on the path of extensive military action and operation, and perhaps even with a ground operation, which we are planning for, because as a military, we need to have the tools in place, if instructed, to mobilize.
How targeted have Israel's military actions been if hundreds of people have died, including children, in Lebanon?
I think proportionality in warfare does not weigh on a number. Proportionality weighs on the military advantage, on distinction, and precaution. And I would say with those three components, the IDF sets a very high standard. And of course, there is a tragic reality that there is a war that is ongoing, a war that Israel did not want, a war that on the 8th of October, Hezbollah decided to launch on Israel and the civilians and the people, the Israelis living in northern Israel. And now we are in I would say, a push to try and restore safety and security to northern Israel. That is the fundamental of the right to life and safety and security that Israelis deserve as well.
So the children who die,
we cannot let Hezbollah dictate that.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're not suggesting we don't defend ourselves, because Hezbollah has chosen intentionally and as a strategy to position all of its assets, from guided missiles to surface-to-coast missiles, to its headquarters, its nerve center, under civilian premises.
So the children that have died and will die as this war continues are collateral damage?
It is heartbreaking to put it in those simplistic terms. But do you think we should not fight for the resumption of 60,000 people to go home? I think it's a very, very tough question to answer. Of course, every single life lost in this war is a tragedy. And I would argue that every single life lost in this war, especially as we push forward against Hezbollah, lies on the shoulders of Hezbollah that initiated, engaged, and decided to launch a war on the civilians of northern Israel.
Thank you for coming on the programme. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, spokesperson for the Israeli Defence Forces.